Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest has worked in many different types of education jobs at numerous grade levels, and he is the author of the nonfiction books Hacking School Discipline Together, Improve Every Lesson Plan with SEL, Hanging In, and 10 Steps to Managing Change in Schools. Additionally, he co-wrote the nonfiction book Teaching the Whole Team with Rachel Poliner, and he has also written a collection of haiku poems. His name is Jeffrey Benson, and here's my interview with Jeffrey. Jeffrey Benson, welcome to Apollo Papyrus.
Glad to be here.
Since it's not really possible to understand your books without understanding your varied career as an educator, you've worked in many different education fields at many different grade levels. What are some jobs in education you've had, and what drove you to be involved in education?
It's a great question. Well, partly because I was a senior in college and I was sick of being in classes, and I was getting a degree in English, partly so I could write and whatever, and realized I hated sitting in classes, and saw that if I could do my last year as an internship at a local high school, I could not go to classes anymore and graduate with a teaching degree. So literally it was just a way to get out of classes. But part of that was also then, empathy for kids who schools never worked well for. I was decent enough as a student. I got by. Um, but I know so many people who school is just something they got through. And it never was ennobling. It never was inspiring. It was just a drag. And so I kind of had this incentive to see if I could make it better for other people, other kids, so many of whom find school just, it's just like something you got to do legally till you're 16. Um, I had a friend once in like middle school, and we're sitting in this incredibly boring class. And he leaned over to me and he says, I think what they're trying to do is make us get used to life being really boring as much as they're bored teaching us. Like, wow, of all the like courses I've done and taught and books I've read in education, I think that was probably the most inspiring thing about what I ended up doing. So I've had a long career. It's almost 50 years now, and I've taught in all sort of settings. And I taught in public middle school, taught in preschools and elementary schools. The largest part of my work with adolescents, but not in to minimize the time I spent with younger kids, but spend a lot of time with adolescents, trying to understand what they're going through in the midst of being in school. And then I got to be an administrator, and maybe it's similar to how I became a teacher. There's this line that most of us who become teachers because we had a teacher or two who really inspired us, as I did, who kept us going, who made us feel seen and heard and valued. And most of us who want to become school administrators just think we can do a better job than the people we've seen. We don't have a lot of great role models. Um, I was lucky that I had a couple of role models, and I have one superpower, which is finding and keeping mentors. So through the years, I've had amazing mentors who have helped me make sense of being in a leadership position. I think everyone who's in a leadership position in an organization should have someone they talk to about having power and how to use that for the greater good, and how to be aware of your triggers to sort of either avoid power when you should enable it, or to overuse it because you're anxious or whatever. So I've gotten to do a ton of stuff. About 10 or 12 years ago, I stopped being a principal and had decades of stories from all my years of being in schools. And I've always done writing, and realized that I could start writing. So I started writing articles and then books. The more you do it, the better you get at, as you know. And so the last 12 years has been consulting, coaching, doing workshops, giving keynotes. But all of that sort of in some ways held up by the writing part of my career. You do get to do more work as a consultant if you've got some books and articles published. I hope that gives you a good sense of things.
You've written multiple nonfiction books about education. Now, I'm going to start with the most recent of them, which is Hacking School Discipline Together.
Yeah.
Without spoiling too much, in Hacking School Discipline Together, what is your book about?
Good books are about many things, but I'll give you the two or three major parts of it. Um, School discipline is mostly about punishment, and discipline doesn't have to be about punishment. It can be about restoring kids to the community so that when we suspend kids or we put them in detention, they don't learn anything and they come back to class or to school. No one knows what's happened inside of them, and they're susceptible to succumbing to the circumstances of their lives and the school as they were before they went into those places. Um, some kids, out of great fear, will kind of suppress their activity, but a lot of kids just end up in, that cycle, back to suspension, back to detention. So restorative discipline looks like, how do you make it a learning experience? We're a learning organization, a school. And it doesn't mean that kids get away with anything, but this is the part that I think is really interesting when I do this work in schools. I always have to say kids don't get away with anything. We hold them accountable. And then I say, because I think sending them to suspension or detention, punishing them, doesn't hold them accountable at all, actually. It's an illusion of accountability. In restorative discipline, the notion is repair the harm. It's not so much about the rule that was broken. It's not like, oh, you did this infraction, therefore you have X amount of minutes in school suspension or whatever. It's what do you have to do to repair the harm? And so that might be cleaning something up. It might be sitting down and talking to somebody and apologizing. It might be doing some community service for the school so that you get to even the score. And the key thing about that is that until you do something to repair the harm, you can't be forgiven. You can't be forgiven if you're just in suspension or detention. But if you make the effort to right your wrong, you've earned forgiveness and you're made whole and you become brought back into the community versus pushed farther out from it. So that's the main kind of notion of restorative discipline, which is happening in a lot of schools. It's tough to change a culture of, I would say, hundreds of years of thinking you can punish kids into new skills or punish them into feeling affiliation with the school. But the other part of it is a lot of my work is about how do you change schools as organizations? How do you help them grow? And so this is how do you turn a school from one that has a culture of punishing kids, because that's what you got in your toolkits, that's what you know, to one of restoring kids. And so the book's it's in, I think, 10 chapters, and it basically follows the school year. And each chapter takes you along kind of what do you do first? What do you do second? What do you do third? And my favorite part of writing the book was at the end of each chapter. I wrote a little novella in the book. At the end of each chapter is a sort of semi-fictional. It's based on all my work in schools for years. It's a group of people in a school who are trying to make the school change. And so they sort of embody the difficulties and the challenges that I raise in each chapter. And it's never like, oh, they've read Benson's book and they're saying this. It's more like, all right, it's time for us to think about what we do in the lunchroom. And so you have a group of characters, about 10 or 12 of them, who talk to each other through the book at the end of each chapter. And that was so much fun to do. I had a very easy sell. The publishers had never had anyone do that in one of their books, but they said give it a try, and then it became sort of one of our favorite parts of the book. And so it's about like the seventh chapter. As you know, when you write fiction, because I've also written a bunch of fiction, is the characters kind of take over. You'd have to go back and rewrite a lot of any story to get a character to act differently after you've introduced them and gotten to know them. So by like the eighth chapter, I could say, oh, I'm going to have Aaron and Jeffrey sit in a room together and have this conversation. And all I knew was it was going to be a great conversation between these two people that would sort of manifest all of the ideas in the book that these two people in their conversation was struggling with within their relationship and within their work with kids. Um, and that was great. So the book had that part of it that I think is really important when you write nonfiction. How people grow and learn is not just intellectually, but it's emotionally too. You need a hook. You need to feel something to remember it, or as somebody who wants people to not just read my book, but to do something with it. It has to inspire you to say, I could do that too. What would it look like to do it? How do real people do this? And I think that was the sort of main benefit of that part of the book, was that people who work in schools would recognize all of those people as people they've run across, sort of not stereotypes, but kind of archetypes. So that's what that book's about. And ultimately, too, I want to say one last part is I always want in my work to bring people back to why they wanted to go into education in the first place. People get worn down by the bureaucracy and the institutionalization of learning. But most of us came into it with a passion for a subject area, a passion for kids, a passion for the sense that we would grow and learn on the job. And I always want to bring people back to their roots in that way. So every book I write has that sort of as a subtext.
How can schools integrate restorative discipline into schools and still hold students accountable for their misbehavior?
Well, so kind of thank you for the question. Going back to part of what I said before. So again, accountability means that you fix the harm you've done. Um, and that, so in the book, and as it works in schools, is if a kid does something in which they have disrupted the class, somebody in the school has to sit and work with the kid. Oftentimes we send them to the office. So the people in the main office, the principal, assistants, principal, disciplinarians, have a menu of options of what do I do with a kid who has just disrupted the cafeteria, who's broken a piece of equipment um, in the playground, who has sworn at a teacher. We're not done holding them accountable until they have a path back. And so there's a certain creativity to it. After a while, it's not like a recipe, but you can say, I've worked with kids a bunch before who, when they've done this, this is the most likely, best way to help them restore themselves. But each kid is a little different puzzle. So anyhow, the administration has a menu of options for what they can do. And then teachers have a menu of options of what they can do in their space. If it's not a situation where you have to send the kid to the office because it's become so disruptive, but you need to spend time with a kid and work it out. How can this not happen again? And that's the other big part of restoration and accountability. After you clean up the harm you did as a kid, you have to plan with the person who's working with you to have a prevention plan. What can we learn from this so that next time this happens, you can escape that situation? So next time this happens, you can chill out. So next time this happens, you can go somewhere where you know someone will talk to you and keep you from doing that next step. In the end, you build better relationships with kids. They are held accountable. I want to come back to that notion. Punishing kids doesn't hold them accountable. It just punishes them. Holding accountable means that you have to repair the harm in the place with the people who were impacted by your behavior. If we don't do that, we're not helping kids grow. And that's part of the work, and grow into better behavior, grow into their, one of my mentors said to me, inside every kid is a better self waiting to be nurtured. And I don't think kids are incorrigible. I think there is a better self in every kid. There are also times, I want to just say this, there are times as an administrator, I did as a principal, you actually have to suspend a kid for a couple of days because you have to have a plan for the kid to come back and everyone to feel safe. The student may have done something in a classroom or a hallway, wherever, that impacted the kids around them. There's like secondary trauma. If I'm a kid and I've seen one of my peers do something really bad or something really disruptive or something that hurt physically or emotionally me or my peers, I don't want that kid showing up the next day. Not unless I've had a chance to, be heard and felt and protected, and that I know that that kid has come back having done some work on his end. I'm using a male pronoun there, on his end, to learn from this situation, and that the adults in the school have a safety plan for him as well for us. So that's, true accountability. And that's is it more work? Only a little upfront, because the amount of times that kids recurringly end up in suspension and detention, one, that's clearly a a criticism of the current system that kids end up repeatedly in suspension and detention. And we want to help kids do better.
I'm going to ask a couple questions I've had written down as one question.
Go for it.
Some of the other nonfiction books you've written include Improve Every Lesson Plan with SEL, uh, Hanging In, and 10 Steps to Managing Change in Schools. And you also co wrote Teaching the Whole Team with Rachel Poliner.
Yep.
Without spoiling too much of those books, what are each of them about?
Let me start with Hanging In. Hanging In was the book that kind of made my writing career. I had an article before that there's a whole bunch of there's a world of educational publication that's generally not, written for the larger public because it's sort of a little in the weeds. Um, and then my work is mostly there. Most of my writing is there. And so Hanging In is a book about difficult kids, challenging kids, kids who are really hard to work with. And for a large part of my career, I was principal of schools for kids who couldn't be in public school because it didn't work for them. They were traumatized, exploited, neglected, abused. They were trans before we knew what that was. They were stoned. They were gay. They didn't feel safe. They couldn't operate in public schools. And they'd come to my schools because I was the principal of 3 different schools like that. And our job was to hang in with them. That kids don't change. You can't, there's no magic. That you have to set up an environment in which they grow day by day. And so I took 13 stories of kids from my school, and I changed the names, sometimes the gender, so I wanted to obscure the original kid, and then also some of the staff people I had to obscure. And I wrote the story about how we learned from this kid and what was the path with each kid, because each kid's kind of a puzzle. How did we hang in as a staff through the kid's struggle to get better? And I think there's a couple of stories in which it's not successful, in which we did our best and it wasn't good enough. And most of the stories, however, are kind of, in the end, the kid succeeds more than they would have had they not been at my schools. Um, and that was the first book my publisher had published that was about those sorts of kids. That was not, the head of the publishing company was a little concerned that a lot of teachers wouldn't read that book because it seemed about like really outlier kids. But it turns out that everyone works with challenging students. We can't, exclude them and put them in your special ed schools all over the country and hope they don't show up in public schools again. And it did really well. And similar to the novella I wrote in Side of Hacking School Discipline Together, each of those chapters, the story, because I had to obscure things, and I combined students, in some ways they're kind of like memoirs, and allowed me the freedom to pick and choose which part of the story I felt really could communicate the passion and the struggle and the things we learned along the way. What the publisher insisted I do, which was helpful in Hanging In, was I just wrote the stories. I thought the stories were enough. And they said, no, you have to kind of explicitly tell people, therefore, what do you do? And so that helped. So at the end of each chapter was, okay, if you have a kid like this, here, 10 steps that I'm pulling out from the chapter that we did that you can adopt in these different ways. So I was Hanging In. 10 steps for managing change in school was, it's in some ways that was incorporated into the Hacking School Discipline Together. I've done a lot of school change work, and it's complicated. Schools have long, long, long histories. They're like a Jenga puzzle. You can't pull one part out without affecting another one. Every school's different. It has different histories, different geographies and geometries, different demographics of students, different community resources. So how do you help people not solve one problem, but how do you say, conceptually, here's how you move a school through a change process? So that book was kind of the nuts and bolts of how to do it. But then I got to put it in the most recent book, embedded within the story. And In some ways, those of you who would like to buy 10 Steps to Hanging In, just buy the Hacking School Discipline Together. I think that's the better book because it's embedded in such a clear story. Um, Teaching the whole teen. Oh man, we just don't do teenagers well in school. Um, Kids who are like 10 years old and kids who are 17 years old in school have just about the same amount of voice and autonomy. Like we don't recognize the changes kids go through in school. We know they get bigger. We know that they have facial hair. We know that their bodies develop. Um, but we don't take into account their need to develop themselves and what their real um, challenges are of adolescence is really not so much about learning the periodic table of elements in chemistry, although I think that's a lovely thing to learn. But it's really how do I find my place in the world? How do I have confidence to move forward into where I think my place is in the world? Um, Almost everybody on the street would fail almost every high school final. So it's really not about the content of the work so much. I mean, I would love everyone to love every bit of curriculum, but I think the ultimate goal of 12 or 13 years of education is how do you find your place in the communities that you will be in? What are your strengths? Where can you move forward? Where do you want to take risks? How do you take safe risks? And you can do that in school. You can do it in the curriculum. There's lots of ways to do it. So we wanted to, in the book, talk about how wonderful teenagers are and all the different ways you can structure a school that actually is more developmentally in alignment with the lives of teenagers than the institutions we have. And I don't blame any teacher or principal for, the current state of schools. I think everyone does their best. I think everyone who goes into the doors of a school every day just wants to have a good day, wants to learn something, and wants to leave and go home and get into bed at night. I just think that we have so many structural impediments to doing that well. So that's teaching the whole team. The book, Improve Every Lesson Plan with SEL. The SEL is social emotional learning. Um, so that's like one of the current, I hate to call it a buzzword, but it's one of the current movements in school. And I mean, it's meaningful. It's an expression of a lot of my work through my career is that you can't teach that human brains function emotionally and socially as much as they do cognitively. That unless you have some skin in the game, literally our brains do not build memories and neural networks of new learning without sort of your whole brain, your whole person being brought into the process. Unfortunately, in a lot of schools, the social emotional learning has become another curriculum. Like, okay, let's do our exercise today in social emotional learning. Let's talk about how we make good eye contact. Okay, I've checked that box. Let's get back to chemistry. Sorry, chemistry teachers, I don't mean to. Let's get back to anything. And you can't put it in a ghetto in your brain. That social emotional learning happens in every class every day, anyhow. So that book, which I'd like to say did really well, I think with the editors, we put together a really great structure for that book. It's how do you, in all the rituals and routines of the class, and as you're teaching whatever subject, there are all these opportunities to enable kids to use social emotional skills so that they're using it in the service of the curriculum and it's not another curriculum. Teachers don't need to be burdened by something else. And it turns out, and there's great research on this now, that schools that take into account kids' social and emotional lives, the kids learn better. Sometimes people say, is this really going to help? And yeah, we've got data now. Kids learn more, they retain more, there's less discipline problems, they're more likely to seek out support in schools, they're more likely to be helpful. We've just got great outcomes from it. So that's the Improve Every Lesson Plan with SEL book. And I think I covered it all. I think I got them all there, right? Yeah.
Are all your books self-published, traditionally published, published by a hybrid press, or did you use different publishing methods to publish
Uh,
your books?
Great, really important question to ask for people who are thinking about this themselves. And by the way, I love helping, mentoring, supporting educators who want to write. And so through my website, jeffreybenson.org, if you write to me and you just want to chat about an idea you have, I've helped a bunch of people kind of go from I would like to write, I'm not sure how to do it, to getting stuff published. It's really fun to do. So the the group that's published three of my books and a whole bunch of my articles in their journal is called ASCD. ASCD. It used to be the Association for Curriculum and Supervision Development, but they dropped all the words and just used the letters ASCD. And they're a really great organization. It's a membership organization. So yeah, in that sense, it's a publishing company. They publish about 10 or 12 books a year and dozens of articles, and they have a great journal each year. So I got started with them because I wrote an article that it didn't go viral like a Taylor Swift song, but it did really well in one of their journals. It's called 100 Repetitions, and I'm happy to say it's, used all over the world, the notion of 100 repetitions. And the editors came to me and said, "Hey, keep writing," which is such, you know, as a new writer, or even an old writer, you just need to get a pat on the back. You just need someone to say, "Well done, keep going. What else you got?" We're all kind of fragile, at the various times in our writing careers. Um, and so they gave me the big pat on the back and said, "Well, else you got?" And I had been framing the idea of the book hanging in, and I told them about it, and they said, "Let's go for it." So they've published, like I said, three of the books: the SEO in every lesson, the hanging in book, and the 10 steps for school change. The teaching the whole teen book, I went to another publishing company. I won't use their name. Um, what was, and I'm going to compare them to ASCD, and it's really helpful and I learned a lot from this. I wish I had known it before the process. ASCD is pretty strict about their product, what it looks like, the packaging and all of that, the fonts, the lexicon you use. So, for instance, in Hanging In, I actually got some swear words in because I wanted to quote exactly what kids said. And I was also their first book that ever had swear words in it. And that was kind of a stretch for them. And then I had an idea for the cover, an idea for the table of contents page. And they very nicely said, "Thank you, no, Jeffrey. We've got a team of people who do that. And, you've done your job writing this wonderful book." And so I didn't get to have input on all of that stuff. But then they were wonderful for marketing, um, partly because they're a member organization. So they send out newsletters all the time to the members, which are 150,000, about all the books they're publishing and conferences they do and things like that. So it was a great way to get an audience. So then the Teaching the Whole Teen book, we went to a different publisher. I was writing with my partner at the time, Rachel Poliner, my work partner. And the other press publisher was incredibly open to everything that Rachel and I suggested. They let us design the cover of the book. They let us design the table of contents. They let us change the house font. We said we wanted a different font, and they gave us an opportunity to show them what our pages would look like with a different font than they used, and they went for it. They let us have so much input into every aspect of putting the book together. It felt like we were just getting to do all the wonderful stuff we wanted to do. The book turned out to be one of their longer books because we had a lot to say and we weren't working with a tight structure. But then they were terrible in marketing. Just the book died. We worked so hard on it. I think it's a great book, and it just died. I make about $87 a year in royalties from that book. And I kind of laugh and tear up a little each time I get that royalty check because we put our heart into it. But if it doesn't get marketed well, and in a field like education, I don't know, there must be a few hundred education books and journals every year. You can just disappear. And then when I told my peers about working for that publisher, at least five of them told me they had the same story. And I was like, man, I wish I had known ahead of time because I would have gone somewhere else. So then the last book, Hacking School Discipline Together, whole different story. I have a buddy named Mark Barnes who was a teacher like me and a school leader and then an author. And then he wanted to start his own publishing company. And so one of the good things about being a consultant and about being a writer, it's like you're a member of a club. And we all talk to each other and write to each other. And Mark had this idea for a book and chatted me up and convinced me that I could write it without it being an incredible heavy lift. And his books come with a very, and see, some publishers, in this case, I didn't want a ton of freedom because it takes a lot of time to wrangle together a structure and an outline of a book. And Mark came to me and said, "No, my book has the book I want you to write has extremely rigid structure. But in this case, it felt like painting by numbers. Like, oh, I could fill in that structure real easily from my 50 years of experiences doing this. This won't be hard." And it wasn't hard. I wrote the book in less than 3 months, and we got it out and published in like 3 months after that, 4 months after that. We buzzed through it. So it was a very different experience. One, working with somebody who knew me really well and trusted me. So when I asked them after I did the first chapter just to see that we were kind of aligned, and I showed them that story idea that's at the end of each chapter. I said, "How often do you want me to send you stuff?" And he just said, "When you're done." A couple times I wrote to the editors and said, "What do you think about this or that?" But mostly I was on my own. At this point in my career, I had enough confidence that I could I could figure out most of the puzzles of writing a book on my own. But it was nice to have a publisher I could call up anytime and just chat about it. So yeah, so very different experiences. All of them are very different. I have, except for the one that couldn't publicize my book enough to make it worth the effort to write it. Each of them has different strengths and weaknesses. I think the most important thing is to get published. And then, you learn a little bit about beyond that. But for those of you who want to write, anyone who's willing to take your book, you should say yes, thank you very much, and get that book out.
Jeffrey, I'm running out of time. I wish I could have asked you a few more questions, but you were an amazing guest. I thank you for appearing on Apollo Papyrus.
Happy to be here. We could always do it another time if you want.
Jeffrey was an amazing and insightful guest, and I enjoyed learning about social and emotional learning. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write and read your passion. Bye for now. Remember to subscribe to the Apollo Papyrus YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/@ApolloPapyrus and the Apollo Papyrus Substack newsletter at apollopapyrus.substack.com. Y'all can visit the Apollo Papyrus website at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/Apollo Papyrus and follow Apollo Papyrus on Threads, Instagram, Facebook, and Tumblr at Apollo Papyrus. Copyright 2024, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.